Okay, I'd like to make a start now, please. So, welcome to Management in the Modern Corporation. That's what you're here for, unless I'm in the wrong place. Alternatively, you're all in the wrong place. I'm Chris Gray. I'm going to be teaching you for about half of the topics on this module, and some of you I'll also be taking for your workshops as well. In a little while, a list is going to be passed around for you to mark your student numbers as a register. But before we begin, and this is something that obviously applies all the way through the course, this clearly is a very large lecture theatre, and that does impose on you certain requirements in terms of how you behave. And in particular, that means whilst we're doing the lecture, you shouldn't be talking or talking to each other or talking on phones or doing anything other than listening. Otherwise, it becomes impossible for people to hear what's going on. In terms of course administration, as I say, I'm giving some of the lectures on the course, but it's not my course. And the information that you need for the course, you should be checking Moodle and downloading information from there. If there are things which you're not sure about, that you need to ask questions about, you need to address them to the course leader, which is Chris Howarth, and his email address is there. Today what I want to do is a fairly gentle introduction to some basic sorts of ideas to do with the study of organisations and the study of management within organisations. So the outline of what we're going to talk about today, well, firstly, what is an organisation, what do we mean by it, and then I'll discuss some kind of key concepts that I think will be helpful to us as we go through the course. And then I'm going to talk about some kind of basic fundamental questions that we need to get a handle on for the rest of the course. And finally, right at the end, I'm going to invite Karen Whiteside, who's there, who is from Royal Holloway International, who wants to have a few minutes of your time. So let's think then, first of all, of this basic idea of what we mean by an organisation, because that's the context in which management necessarily occurs. When we talk about management, we're talking about a social activity. There's more than one person involved. Okay, we could talk about the way we manage ourselves, or if we manage to be on time, but normally we're talking about a coordinative activity of groups of people. And one basic and often seen definition that you'll see in textbook is the idea of groups of people acting together in order to achieve a common aim. And I say there on the slide, and these slides, by the way, if you haven't already realised it, these slides were pre-available on Moodle. If you didn't see that in future, check and you can get them. And there's a problem here because people in organisations don't necessarily have a common aim. We might say, what's the purpose of the organisation? We might say, well, it's to make a profit, perhaps. But if you ask the people who work there, well, what is your aim? They might say, well, I want to advance my career. Or, I want to keep my job. Or, I want to earn some money. And we can see that perhaps very clearly if we think about this course as being a certain kind of organisation. What is its purpose? What is its aim? Well, I might say, we're here to learn. And you might perhaps, inside your heads, as I say that, be thinking, well, I'm here because I've got to be here, it's compulsory. I'm here because my parents think I should be here. I'm here to get a job. Some of you may be just thinking, I don't really know why I'm here at all. Yeah? And so, this idea that we can specify an organisation as if it had a single aim or a single set of aims is not really an entirely satisfactory one. So a better, all these kinds of definitions one can contest and one can debate, but a better kind of definition is this, I think, which talks in terms of groups of people acting together in order to achieve their various aims. And so that recognizes that there will be differences within any organization about what people are trying to achieve. And then I put there, well, the problem with that might be people don't necessarily know their aims. And that perhaps seems a slightly stupid thing to say. Well, why wouldn't someone know their aims? But, you know, often if you do, say, were to do a questionnaire of people in a company and say, well, why are you here? Why are you at work? They might say, very often they might answer, well, I'm here to earn some money because I need money in order to live. But very often, when somebody loses their job, yes, they find that they miss having the money, and that's a problem. But they will also often find that they miss other things as well, like having a sense of purpose, having some kind of meaning, having the sort of social contact that people get out of being at work. But they don't necessarily realize that at the time. So this is a better definition, but it still has some limitations. And all the time that we talk about organization, we have to bear in mind that it has two possible kinds of meaning. The organization can be a noun, it can be a thing. We say the organization, the company, the university. But it's also an activity. It's a verb, to organize, the organization of the company, the organization of the organization. And that process of organization is an ongoing one. That for an organization to exist, every day, every hour, every minute, it has to be made and remade. And right now, all of us sitting here, or in my case, standing here, all of us are engaged in the process of organizing. We are making and remaking Royal Holloway, University of London. Now, you've all done it. Now, now, now. You're doing it all the time. All the time you sit there being students, and I stand here being a professor. We are making and remaking the organization. Organization is not just a thing, Royal Holloway, it's a process. It's the doing, it's the making of organization. And management has a very particular part to play within that, but it is only one part. If we would still think about us here as being a kind of an organization, and you might, in that context, want to say, well, maybe I'm the manager. I'm, you know, in some way in charge. But my being in charge is absolutely dependent on the actions of all of you. The fact that you are sitting there being students is what makes it possible for me to be a lecturer. Okay? And so it can't be wholly controlled by the manager. And let us explain that in a slightly more systematic way. The reason for that is that whenever we talk about organization, whether we mean the thing, an organization, or we mean the process, organizing, there are always two things going on at the same time. And one of them is formal organization, and it is, if you like, the things that are meant to be happening. So, for example, almost all organizations nowadays have a mission statement saying what it is what their purpose is, what their mission is. But at the same time, those things which are meant to happen, which are very often to do with the rules in an organization, that there will be the things that are actually happening at the same time. So the formal organization is what is meant to happen, and the informal organization is what actually happens. How does that work? Well, when you come into a lecture theatre like this, there are rules governing what goes on. One of the rules, or three of the rules, if you like, are, and there's a sign, I think, somewhere as you come in saying this, no drinking, no eating, no smoking. Okay? No drinking, no eating, no smoking. So what's going on now? No drinking, no eating, no smoking. So what's going on now? Because I know that that rule doesn't apply. Because informally, we know that it's okay to have a drink of water in a lecture. It's probably okay to what? To eat a bit of banana. It's not really okay to sit down and have a sort of three-course meal. And it certainly isn't okay to start smoking. And so already we can see that there's a difference between the rules, how it's meant to be, and the informal thing, what's actually meant to happen. If you go outside, then I will have a cigarette, and there's a sign outside on all of the buildings here saying, strictly no smoking within 5 meters of this building. But we all know that that rule isn't a real rule, and I'm certainly not going to obey it. Okay? And so we always have that kind of slippage. Your job contract might say, you work 8 hours a day, starting at 9 and leaving at 5. But actually, you know it's okay to leave at 4 o'clock on a Friday. You're not meant to use the internet for personal use. But actually, you know it's okay if you just do it at lunchtime. Okay? So that disjuncture, that formal and informal, means that organizations are never just about a set of rules. If they were, then management would be easy. Because if it was just the formal organization, then we would just say, right, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, and management would be straightforward. But it's because, in reality, people don't comply with the rules that makes management an issue. So often, or sometimes, these things are going to be in tension with each other. For example, we might say informally it's okay to go off and have a break to go to the toilet, let's say. But if people are constantly going off and not being at the workplace, then that becomes a problem. So how do you negotiate that formal and informal? And a lot of what management is about trying to make sure that somehow those two things match up. That there's not too huge a gap, not too huge a divergence between what's meant to happen and what actually does happen. Now, whilst we're talking about organisational rules, let me mention that now is the moment when the class register is being passed round. And the formal rule is that you will write your student number. But in this case, there is going to be no informal organisation because you're all going to obey. Okay? So that's one key concept. Another important rule is you should arrive on time. And future infractions. I have cigarettes in one pocket and a small gun in the other. So that was the first key concept, the distinction between formal and informal organisation. Now let me talk about the second concept for today, and that's the distinction between ownership and control. And this again is central to understanding what management is. So when we talk about ownership, we're talking fairly obviously about who it is who actually legally owns an organisation. So you might imagine somebody who sets up a business and they own that business. And by control, we mean the people who run the organisation. And in a small start-up company, where someone sets up a business, perhaps begins to employ some other people, then that ownership and control will be together. Yeah? The same person or people, maybe it's a family business, the same person or people who own it also control it. The owners manage. But in almost all large organizations, that is not true. Because in almost all large organizations, ownership and control are separate things. Why is that? Well, let's imagine this business that you set up. The first thing that might happen if it's successful is that it gets bigger. And as it gets bigger, it's going to become harder and harder for the person, or the family perhaps, who own it, to go on running it themselves. It's just going to be too complex an organisation because it's too big. And also, it's likely to require more and more specialist tasks. That as your business expands, you perhaps need to get in somebody who is an expert in accounting, or an expert in finance, or an expert in selling, or in marketing. And so you're going to start hiring managers. And if you look at the way that family businesses evolve historically, that they typically start by trying to use a wider and wider circle of the family as managers, but then eventually that becomes impossible. Why? Because your family is probably not big enough, some of them may not be trustworthy, and some of them are too thick to trust your business with. So again, you look outside, you look for professional managers to come and run your company for you. And that process of the development of management is outlined in many places, but you could look in Rosabeth Moss-Kanter's book, Men and Women of the Corporation. A second thing that's likely to happen to your business if it's successful is that after a certain point, you think, well, great, the business is making loads of money. Do I want to spend the rest of my life flogging my guts out to make it more and more successful? Or would I like to spend the rest of my life sunning myself on a beach in the Bahamas? And perhaps unsurprisingly, for many business owners, the answer is, well, I would rather go and sun myself on a beach in the Bahamas. So what do? You bring in a manager to run it for you. And as soon as you do that, ownership and control begin to separate. Another obvious thing that happens as a business expands is that it needs more capital to invest to continue expanding. What do you do about that problem? Well, an obvious thing you do is you sell shares in your company in order to bring money in to invest, perhaps in new equipment. And the people you sell the shares to have a share in the ownership of it. And so again, ownership and control begin to separate. And this separation creates a potentially very important problem in organizations. Because the suggestion, and this idea goes back certainly to the 1930s, the idea that the people who now control a company, the managers, may not have the same interests as the people who own it. Why not? Because if you own the company, arguably, we could debate this and maybe we'll do later in the course, but if you own the company, arguably what you want is to have the highest level of profit possible. But that's not necessarily true for the managers. The managers, for example, might say, I'd like to have the highest level of salary possible. And that salary is going to be at the expense of owner's profit. So that's one example of the way that managers may not have the same interests as owners. So ownership and control, that distinction, is also an important concept Firstly, because it explains why we have managers, and secondly, because it explains that managers and owners may have different interests. And then the third of the key concepts I want to talk about today. And that is the idea of the division of labour, and the idea that in an organisation there will be specialisation of tasks, that different people do different things. Again, imagine a small firm that starts up, perhaps a family-run firm. There, you could imagine someone doing all of the tasks. Perhaps you open a shop, and you will sometimes be stacking the shelves, and sometimes be working on the till, and sometimes going and picking up new stock, and sometimes doing the accounts. But then if you think about a big chain of supermarkets, let's say, then of course that's not going to be the case. You're going to have some people who are just doing shelf stacking, some people who are just on the tills, some people who are just doing the accounts, and all of the other functions. And this is enormously important. It's a kind of basic idea of organisation, that people are doing different tasks. You could imagine how that gets you, how you get a shift there from people working in craft capacity. Imagine people making a table. You're making a table in a workshop. Traditionally, as a craftsperson making a table, you would make the tabletop, you would make the legs, you would make all the bits and pieces that go into a table. But when you begin to have a division of labour, one person does one particular part of the process. One person perhaps makes the leg, or one person just makes part of the leg. And so the tasks get divided smaller and smaller and smaller, and in some way that division of labour is the thing that has to be managed, isn't it? Because if you split the work down into component parts, then something has to hold it together, and that something is management. And why does that matter? Well, on the one hand, historically, because you could say the story, really, the story of industrialization since the 18th century to the present day, the story of that industrialization is the growth in productivity that comes from division of labour. Because when you have people doing specialized tasks, they become, by definition, specialists at doing that task. They produce more and more and more and more and more. But at the same time, the work that they do becomes more and more boring. And so the management problem that arises from this is that people doing very boring jobs are not likely to have high morale, they're not likely to care about their work, they're not likely to produce a quality product, they're not likely to be very happy. And as we will see as we go through the course, that problem of the dissatisfaction caused by division of labour is one of the central problems and the central tasks of management. And now I want to come on to these three questions that I want us to think about a little bit. OS here means organisation studies, because it's in the study of organisations where we study management. And the questions are, is it a science? Who is it for? And what's the unit of analysis? So first of all, let's talk about whether it's a science. Well, the problem there is immediately we have another question, which is, what does it mean to say that something is a science? And you could spend 3 years or more at a university studying nothing but the question of what is a science. But fortunately for you, I have distilled that 3-year course into 2 minutes. And this is the result. One thing we might mean by a science would be something that we would associate with, basically, with natural sciences. So the idea of a kind of an agreed body of knowledge where you've got general laws that predict things. So something like a theory of gravity, where we can have a theory, we can observe empirically whether reality corresponds to it, and then we can make predictions. For example, that an object will drop at a certain speed or with a certain acceleration. And if we mean that, then management and the study of organizations is not a science. Because very little of that kind of thing exists. And in a few minutes I'll try to explain why that is the case. But if we meant something else by science, if we meant something like the second thing up there, something that's systematic, that's based on research, that we can use to understand, in some way to inform our practice, then I think the answer is either maybe or yes. And so that, I think, is the sense of science that we are dealing with. Now, why is that different? Why can't we have a sort of a strong, natural science of organizations? Well, because when we deal with organizations, we're dealing with people. And when we deal with people, that means that it is a kind of social science, not a natural science. And at the core of that idea is the fact that when we deal with social science, we deal with people, and people can make choices. The word that we use for that is that they have agency. They're agents. They can choose. They can do things differently. They're not just objects. So if we were to take as our scientific example the idea that water will freeze to ice at 0 degrees centigrade given standard pressure, the ice or the water has no choice about that because natural objects have no agency. People do. And that means that they can choose to behave differently. It also means that people behave differently at different times and in different cultures. Again, that's not true of water and ice. Water will freeze at 0 degrees at standard pressure, regardless of what period of history it was, regardless of what culture you live in. But can women be good managing directors? That's something which varies clearly in time and in cultures as to the answer that people would give. So people exist within a wider kind of social structure that affects the way that they behave. And because of this, people act differently in response to the way that they're treated. Water being frozen into ice doesn't care how you treat it. It has no feelings about the matter. It's not going to say, oh, well, you've been horrible to me today, so I'm not going to freeze. It doesn't have that option. And in particular, water freezing into ice is unaffected by the prediction you make about it. If I had the apparatus here now and I said, I predict it will freeze, it makes no difference that I've predicted it. But if I predict, you don't dare to get up and leave the room. Now, he doesn't. Now there's a possibility that he's going to do something different because of my prediction. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why we can't have scientific laws in the natural science sense that make predictions about how people will behave, because they have choices and because they act differently. And of course, finally, the way that we study people, the ideas that we have about how to manage them, about how to organize people, that those things also entail various kinds of value judgments. After all, we're doing a course about management. We could just devote our entire 3 years to talking about how to run a slave ship. You know, it's got something going for it. People can't answer back. You know more or less what they're going to do. You don't have to pay them. And it's always fun giving someone a good whipping. So I'm told. But of course we might say, but is there not a problem with treating people in that horrible way? And the answer is, well, there is, but it's a value judgment. And so whenever we are doing this kind of study of social things, we are engaged in value judgments. And of course, all of that sounds very theoretical, but it matters directly for management, because it means that we can't manage in the way that we do with inanimate objects. Some people would like to think that management is like pulling levers, like being an engineer. But it's not, because of those reasons I just gave about human agency. And in particular, the issue of the fact that the way that people are treated will make a difference to how they act. For example, if I say to you, OK, I'm the boss, I want you to do exactly what you're told, and I don't want to hear any of your opinions. OK? One possibility is that this person reacts very badly and says, well, I don't want to be treated like that, and they refuse to be managed in that way. Okay? And we can't predict that because it depends on all kinds of things. It depends on her personality, it depends on her background, it depends on it may depend on her culture, it depends on all kinds of things like that. But on the other hand, supposing that she does accept that, and she says, that's fine. When I was a student, I used to work on a building site, and there was a guy there who was a carpenter, and he used to say, the thing about me is, I'm only paid from the neck downwards. Yeah? I'm not paid to think. OK, so now, supposing she accepts, you just do exactly what you're told, then that is then also going to have an effect in terms of, supposing then I turn around and say to her a few days later, well, why did you make that mistake? Can't you take any initiative? And she will say, but you told me, I just had to do what you said. Yeah? So the way that we treat somebody is going to have an impact on the way that they behave. We don't always know what it's going to be, but we know that it's going to be there. We know that she is a human being and not a block of ice. Okay? And of course, all that stuff about value judgments means that somehow, whenever we think about managing an organization, it has an ethical dimension to it. And how could that not be? Because if part of what management is getting other people to do things, then of course it's going to make a difference. Of course it's going to have an ethical component. It might be okay for me to say, I just want you to exactly follow my orders. They're starting new in the organization. But what if I were to say, OK, and my orders today are, I'd like you to polish my shoes. Okay. Suddenly, we think to ourselves, but that isn't something that a manager can ask a worker to do. Why not? Well, it's wrong. Yeah? Something's wrong about it. So, it tells us that there are value judgments, ethical judgments to be made. Then let's think about the question about who it's for. And really, and one of the things that's quite complicated when you start reading the literature that you're going to read for this course, is that it comes from all kinds of different perspectives. And it's not as straightforward as you might think. And roughly, you can say that the work that's been written about management in organizations falls into three broad camps. And one kind of camp says, well, what we're studying this for is to help managers to manage more effectively. But of course, we've already seen there could be a problem with that, because different people in the organisation will have different ideas about how things should be run, have different ideas about what the purpose is. And even different groups of managers. If you were to say to a sales manager, you know, what is the key issue? They might say, well, the issue is to increase sales. If you were to talk to an accountant, they might talk in terms of the cash flow of the business or the profitability of the business. And so there's a problem, I think, with this unitarist view, but nonetheless, a lot of the literature that we read takes that kind of assumption. A second kind of literature is more in line with that definition I gave earlier, the idea that actually we can study management and organisations not just in terms of what managers want to do or in terms of managing more effectively, but because all of us live in organisations. From the moment that we are born, most of us, many of us, will be born in a hospital. It's an organisation. The point at which you die, you'll be taken off by an undertaker. It's an organisation. There is virtually no facet of our lives that is not lived in organisations. And if that is right, then it means that we're not just doing something which is of interest to managers and effective management, but something which is potentially of interest to us just as human beings. And then quite a lot of the literature that you will read is much more conflictual than that, and it will see things in terms of there being some kind of conflict between, in particular, between managers and employees, or sometimes between shareholders and managers, and the purpose is usually much more to do with exploring or explaining this conflict. It's not to do with making managers manage more effectively. It's much more to do with social change. The thing about all those viewpoints, which I want to stress for you, is that they are all political viewpoints. They're all about how you think society should be run, because organisations, particularly businesses and public sector organisations, are central to society. So often when we study management, it's very difficult to separate it out from political. By political, I don't mean really the politics like different political parties. I mean political in the sense of values and ideologies and ideas about how society should be. And when you read the literature that is on the reading list, you will find, my guess is that for many of you, when initially you come to it, you will find it enormously surprising. And you might perhaps imagine that what you're going to see is a whole lot of books saying, this is how you should manage an organisation. When you come to look at it, you'll find it's enormously more complicated than that, precisely because management and organisations is this more kind of contested, political kind of thing than perhaps you're expecting. And another consequence of that is this set of things which I want to talk to you about, which is when we study management and organisations, we're very often moving between a lot of different kinds of level of analysis, different kinds of unit of analysis. One part of it is about focusing on individuals. Why? Because individuals make up organisations. In some way, you could say an organisation is the total of all the individuals within it. And so some of the things that are relevant to us are ideas that come from psychology. What motivates people? What are their inner drives? What are their fears? What are their anxieties? Those kinds of things might be relevant in the workplace. But of course, when people work together, they don't work as individuals, they work as a collective. And one version of that collective is they might work as a group or as a team. And there we need a different set of ideas to understand it. And most of those ideas will come from social psychology, how small groups of people interact together. And then we're interested at an organizational level. In other words, the organization as a whole, and often the ideas there will come from sociology. And then we're interested at a societal level, because organizations don't exist in a vacuum. They exist, they both constitute and are part of society as a whole, the economy as a whole, the polity as a whole. So actually, all of these things are going to be relevant to us, and it's hard to see how you could understand management or understand organization without being attentive to those things, because they all link up, they're all intertwined together in some kind of way. And this brings me to what perhaps is the most complicated thing I want to say today. Often when we think about social things, and often in the things that are written about social things, including organizations and management, you will find that it falls into two kinds of poles. One that looks more or less at the level of individuals, which is to say agency, like I said earlier, or action is another word that's sometimes used for it. And another that looks at a structural level, that looks at the collective, and explains things differently accordingly. Let me try to make perhaps a bit more sense for you. Think about, we'll forget organizations for the moment. Think about crime, someone committing crime. Now, one person might say, one analyst might say, if you want to understand crime, it's to do with the individuals. That person there who committed the crime is a bad person. They chose to burgle the house. Okay. And that is an action or agency explanation. Okay? It's saying it's the individual. But someone else might say, that person comes from a deprived neighborhood, they had a terrible family upbringing, they had a very poor education, they're unemployed. That's what explains the crime. And that is a structure explanation. Yeah? It's saying that what the individual did was kind of determined by circumstances. And so people talk about then an action structure dualism. And that means when you say either it's explained by the individual or it's explained by circumstance. But actually, and I would say most writing on social issues and certainly most writing on organizations and management in recent years has said that is a false dichotomy. And that to understand organizations and management, we have to see it's not either action or structure, but it's both and. It's action and structure. Let me try to make sense of that idea for you a little bit as well. Think about something like language, the English language, if you like. It has rules. You can't just make up your own language. If you spoke a language you just made up, then no one would understand. It wouldn't be a language. Language functions because it has structures and rules that you have to obey. But on the other hand, that language wouldn't exist if nobody talked it. And actually, over time, the meaning of words changes because we choose to use them in different ways. So language has both structure and action at the same time, both a system and individuals. So now let's come back to organizations and put that in terms of something that I tried to say to you earlier on. On the one hand, an organization, let's say Royal Holloway, it has a structure. We're not all here in this room because we all spontaneously thought, oh, let's turn up here. There's a system of timetabling, a system of room booking, a system of hiring, a system of student allocation. And we can't understand the organization without understanding that structure. But equally, The organisation is only happening because of the fact that we are all choosing to do it. None of us are here compulsorily. None of us are here because none of us would be shocked if we weren't here. We're choosing in some way to be here, and that's agency. And every single management situation and every single organisational situation always has those two components. It always has something that's systematic and something that's individual to do with choice. And that's the reason why, on the one hand, management can't just be about telling people what to do because they've got agency, but on the other hand, management can't just be about individuals' needs because there have to be systems. So organisation is always a duality of action and structure. It's both a system and it's about individual choices, decisions and actions. And now finally, I would like to ask Karen. You know, I've just remembered also that Karen has a background in linguistics and probably could tell you that what I just said about language is wrong. But, so Karen is now going to talk about Royal Holloway International.